It's been 23 years since that night in Dudleytown, but it still feels like yesterday. I was 16 back then, in high school, stuck in that weird in-between phase where you're old enough to know better, but young enough to do stupid things anyway. I grew up in a small town, just a few miles from Cornwall, Connecticut, where Dudleytown sat in the middle of dark entry forest. Locals talked about that place with a strange mix of fear and reverence, the kind of tone that makes you curious, even when you know you shouldn't be. I first heard about Dudleytown from my dad. He didn't say much, just called it the Cursed Forest, and told me to stay away. Later, I learned the history. Dudleytown was a settlement from the 1700s, founded by descendants of the Dudley family. Rumor had it, they were cursed, and bad luck seemed to follow them. Crops failed, livestock died, people went mad. Eventually, the entire place was abandoned. Over time, the forest reclaimed it, leaving behind a few crumbling foundations and ghost stories that felt a little too real. For a school project, I had to research a historical site nearby, and my group, 5 of us, thought Dudleytown would be perfect. I'd like to say we were genuinely interested in the history, but let's be real, we were just looking for a thrill. We were scared out of our minds, but too proud to admit it. No one wanted to be the one to back out, so we hyped each other up until we couldn't say no. The night we went, it was colder than I expected. We parked about a mile away and hiked in, flashlights cutting through the dense trees. The air felt heavy, like the forest was pressing down on us, and every little sound made us jump. We joked around to keep the mood light, but it was forced. I could tell everyone was on edge. We'd been exploring for maybe an hour when things started to feel off. At first, it was just little stuff. Branches snapping in the distance, shadows moving just out of sight. We told ourselves it was the wind or an animal, but deep down, I think we all knew better. Then, we noticed him. A figure in the distance, just standing there, watching us. He was too far away to make out any details, but we could tell it was a man. We froze, whispering to each other about what to do, but before we could decide, he started moving. Slowly at first, then faster. Panic set in, and we ran. 5 of us, crashing through the trees like idiots, barely able to see where we were going. In the chaos, we got separated. 3 of us ended up together, but Mark, one of the guys in our group, ran off on his own. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, Mark was nowhere to be found. We called out for him, but there was no answer. Worse, we realized the man was still following us. We could hear him moving through the trees, always just far enough away that we couldn't see him clearly, but close enough to keep us terrified. We thought about calling the cops, but we knew we'd get in trouble for trespassing. So, we stayed together, clinging to each other, too scared to split up again. We wandered for hours, lost and desperate, calling Mark's name into the darkness. We found him 6 hours later. He was inside one of the abandoned houses, lying on an old, rotting bed. His hands were clutching his head, and his eyes were wide open, bulging like he'd seen something no one should ever see. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at the ceiling like he was frozen in time. That image is burned into my brain. Even now, after all these years, I can still see it like it just happened. We didn't know what to do. None of us did. We were terrified, genuine panic coursing through all of us. At 16 years old, we knew we'd get into serious trouble if anyone found out we'd been there. In the end, we called the older brother of one of the guys in the group. He tore into us when he found out where we were and what had happened, but he panicked too. He was just as scared as we were, but luckily, he helped us get out of there. We all agreed to make up a story. We lied and said we'd been wandering near the forest, and Mark had fallen. That was the explanation we gave when we finally got him to the hospital, still in that unresponsive, catatonic state. I know we shouldn't have lied. I know it was wrong. Even now, that decision haunts me. But we were kids. scared out of our minds, with one of our friends completely unresponsive, and the memory of being chased by a stranger in a forest full of horrifying legends still fresh in our heads. Our group fell apart after that night. We never really talked about what happened, at least, not in detail. I think we were all trying to pretend it hadn't happened, like we could forget if we just didn't say it out loud. For a while, I thought Mark had moved on. His family had moved away from the area for a while, seeking help from a renowned psychiatrist in Louisiana. After that, I didn't hear anything more about Mark, and I genuinely thought that eventually, with time and care, he had gone back to normal. I thought about calling him many times, but we didn't have any way to get in touch. But 2 months ago, I got a call from one of the guys in our group. He told me Mark had been in a psychiatric hospital ever since that night. He'd never recovered, never spoken a word about what he saw in Dudleytown. I debated whether or not to visit him, but the guilt ate at me until I finally gave in. When I saw him, I barely recognized him. He just sat there, staring out the window, completely disconnected from the world. It was like a part of him had been left behind in that forest, and no one could bring it back. I don't know what happened to Mark that night, and I probably never will. But I do know one thing. Going into that forest was the worst decision of my life. I'm sharing this story not to encourage anyone to explore Dudleytown, but to warn you. Sometimes the risks you take to seem cool or brave aren't worth it. If I could go back and do it all over again, I'd stay as far away from that place as possible. Trust me, nothing is worth losing yourself. Hey, horror spectator here. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on post notifications so you're always in the loop when new videos drop. We post 2 videos every week. If you're really into this content, consider sharing it with your friends. It really helps us grow this community. Now, let's move on to the second story. I could start this story by saying I was just a kid and didn't know any better, but that's not the case. When I decided to do this, I was already an adult, in my 30s, and I considered myself a responsible person. On the day everything happened, I was feeling completely down, and one of my childhood friends, Chris, suggested we hit a bar to drown my sorrows. Normally, this wasn't my kind of scene, and he knew it. But that day, I was so low, I didn't see another option and said yes. It was supposed to be just a night out with a friend to clear my mind. But we somehow ended up in Dark Entry Forest, with no memory of what happened there, both in a deplorable state. But I'm getting ahead of myself. When I walked into the bar, I felt a small weight lift off my chest. As the night went on, I kept drowning my sorrows in drink, and at some point, both Chris and I were on cloud 9. This was where everything started going wrong. I think I only agreed to it because I wasn't used to drinking. I was completely aware of my decision and knew what I was getting into, but it felt like the barrier that would normally have stopped me had disappeared entirely. It must have been around 1 a.m. when the bar closed, and Chris suggested we go explore Dark Entry Forest, specifically Dudleytown. We lived only a few miles away, and even though it was illegal and filled with no trespassing signs, it didn't seem like a problem at the time. We drove there in his car, the road twisting and turning through dense woods as the headlights barely pierced the blackness. When we parked at the edge of the forest, I immediately noticed how the air felt colder. Not just a crisp night chill. This was different, sharper, like stepping into a refrigerator. Chris noticed it too, but we laughed it off, blaming the alcohol and our imaginations. Dudleytown, infamous for its dark history, felt like it was cloaked in its own microclimate. Dudleytown was once a small settlement in the 1700s, but it had a reputation for bad luck. Farmers losing crops, strange disappearances, and, of course, whispers of curses. Over time, people abandoned it, leaving the forest to swallow the remnants of the town whole. The locals had a name for it: the Village of the Damned. The stories had always scared me as a kid, but tonight they only added to the thrill. We ventured deeper into the woods, using our phone flashlights to guide us. The deeper we went, the colder it got. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. At first, it was just the crunch of our boots on the forest floor and the occasional rustle of leaves. But soon, there were other noises, faint whispers carried on the wind, the crack of a branch breaking underfoot, though neither of us had stepped on one. "Did you hear that?" Chris asked, his voice hushed. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "It's probably just animals." But as we approached the remnants of Dudleytown, the shadows seemed to move. The houses, or what was left of them, loomed out of the darkness like broken teeth. Roofs had caved in, walls were crumbling, and vines crept over the skeletal remains. Yet even in their decay, the structures seemed to watch us, their darkened windows like empty eyes. We decided to explore one of the larger houses. Its door hung off its hinges, and the wooden floor groaned under our weight. Inside, the air was damp and carried a faint metallic scent. My flashlight illuminated graffiti on the walls, a mix of crude drawings and unsettling symbols. The atmosphere was suffocating, as if the house itself didn't want us there. Then I felt it, a sudden, sharp pain in my chest. It wasn't like anything I'd ever felt before, searing, paralyzing. I clutched at my shirt, gasping, but before I could say anything to Chris, everything went black. When I regained consciousness, the sunlight was streaming through the trees. I was lying on the forest floor, my head pounding and my body aching. Chris was next to me, groaning as he struggled to sit up. Both of us were covered in scratches and bruises. His shirt was torn, and when he moved, he winced, holding his side. Before we could process what had happened, we heard footsteps. A man emerged from the woods, an older guy with a weathered face and a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked as startled to see us as we were to see him. He approached, clearly torn between running in the opposite direction or realizing we genuinely needed help and coming to our aid. Then he asked us if we were okay, if we needed help, and if we had been attacked by some animal. We didn't have an answer. Instead, we stumbled to our feet, mumbling something about getting lost. The man didn't press further, but he kept his distance, eyeing us warily as we made our way back to Chris's car. At the hospital, we didn't dare tell the doctors where we'd been. Trespassing in Dudleytown was a surefire way to get into trouble, and we were already in enough of a mess. Chris had a fractured rib, and both of us were covered in cuts and bruises that neither of us could explain. The last thing we remembered was entering that house. After that, it was a void. But sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, flashes come back to me. Shadows moving in the darkness, whispers that weren't carried by the wind, and a pair of eyes gleaming in the black. We never talked about it again. Chris moved away a few months later, and I've avoided Dark Entry Forest ever since. But sometimes I wonder, did we disturb something that night? Something that should have been left alone? I never believed in these things, and most of the time, I still don't. I tend to think there's a very logical explanation for everything, even if I can't find it. The problem is at night. On those nights when I feel truly alone and start to doubt what I believe. I don't have any answers. I don't even know what to say. All I know is this. Dudleytown isn't just a place where bad luck lingers. It's a place that takes something from you, something you can never get back. When I was a child, curiosity ruled my life. My parents often joked that I could unravel the mysteries of the universe if given enough time and books. But no subject ever captivated me quite like Dudleytown, a small, abandoned settlement in Cornwall, Connecticut. It was a place shrouded in mystery, with tales of curses, tragedies, and hauntings. While most kids my age were fascinated by superheroes or cartoons, I found myself drawn to the dark allure of Dudleytown's history. For my 12th birthday, my parents gifted me a book, that would solidify my obsession. Legend of Dudleytown: Solving Legends Through Genealogical and Historical Research. I devoured its pages, immersing myself in the tragic tales of the Dudley family and the eerie fate of their settlement. The Dudley family's story was one of misfortune stretching back centuries. Edmund Dudley, executed for treason in 1510, was said to have cursed his lineage. Generations of his descendants faced tragedy, from plagues to financial ruin. And those who settled in Dudleytown seemed no different. The rocky, infertile land was unsuitable for farming, leading to poverty and isolation. By the late 1800s, the settlement had dwindled to nothing. Paranormal enthusiasts claimed the area was cursed, with reports of shadowy figures, unexplained cold spots, and sinister markings. Yet, beneath the legends lay the cold, hard truths of history. And that was what fascinated me the most. Years passed, and my passion for Dudleytown only grew stronger. When the time came to choose a subject for my master's thesis, there was no question in my mind. I would dedicate my research to uncovering the real story of Dudleytown. As a historian, I prided myself on skepticism. I wasn't interested in ghost stories or curses. I wanted to understand the social, economic, and environmental factors that had shaped the settlement's decline. With the university's backing and the necessary permissions secured, I planned a week-long field study to document the area. Arriving in Dudleytown was a surreal experience. The journey through winding country roads brought me to a dense forest, its ancient trees casting long shadows even at midday. Though I had studied maps and photos, nothing could have prepared me for the oppressive atmosphere of the place. It wasn't the eerie silence or the overgrown remnants of foundations that unsettled me. It was the inexplicable weight in the air, as if the land itself carried the burden of its history. Excitement warred with an unshakable sense of dread as I set up my base camp on the outskirts of the forest. The first 2 days were a whirlwind of activity. I spent hours hiking through the woods, photographing the crumbling remains of stone walls and cellar holes. I meticulously documented everything, from the topography to the layout of the abandoned homesteads. Yet, as much as I was driven by academic purpose, I couldn't ignore the creeping unease that settled over me. By the second night, I began experiencing dark, intrusive thoughts that seemed to come from nowhere. I dismissed them as a side effect of isolation and fatigue, determined not to let my mind play tricks on me. On the third day, everything changed. That morning, I set out early, determined to explore the area's northeastern edge, where a cluster of ruins lay hidden beneath decades of overgrowth. The hike was grueling, the rocky terrain and tangled roots testing my endurance. By late afternoon, I reached the site and spent hours documenting a particularly well-preserved foundation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized how exhausted I was. My limbs felt leaden, my thoughts sluggish. Yet I couldn't ignore the faint sense of foreboding that had been building all day. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, the air heavy with an oppressive stillness. Then I saw it. A thin mist rising from the ground, coiling around the trees like a living thing. My pulse quickened. This phenomenon had been mentioned in numerous accounts of Dudleytown, often as a precursor to paranormal experiences. Despite my exhaustion, curiosity drove me to investigate. Camera in hand, I followed the mist deeper into the woods, ignoring the growing unease gnawing at the edges of my mind. As I ventured further, the oppressive silence gave way to an almost imperceptible sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like branches knocking against each other in the wind. But there was no wind. The sound grew louder, more erratic, and soon it was joined by something far more disturbing: laughter. It was the high-pitched, hysterical giggle of a child, but there was something unnatural about it. A sharp, discordant edge that made me experience a cold rush through my body, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. But but the forest remained still. My logical mind insisted it was just an animal or an auditory illusion. But deep down, I knew better. The laughter grew closer, echoing from all directions. My heart surged as I turned in circles, desperately trying to pinpoint its source. Shadows seemed to shift at the edge of my vision, darting between the trees. Panic set in as the laughter rose to a crescendo, a manic cacophony that drowned out all rational thought. I stumbled backward, tripping over roots and rocks as I tried to escape the unseen presence. I had lost all sense of direction, my only focus on escaping the relentless laughter that seemed to follow me wherever I went. Hours passed in a blur of terror and confusion. I wandered aimlessly, my flashlight's beam flickering as the battery drained. The laughter ebbed and flowed, sometimes distant, sometimes unnervingly close. My thoughts grew darker with each passing moment, a relentless tide of despair and self-loathing that threatened to overwhelm me. By the time the sun began to rise, I was a shell of myself, physically and mentally shattered. Somehow, I found my way back to my car, though I have no memory of the journey. I left Dudleytown without a second glance, driving away from the place that had broken me. In the days that followed, I tried to rationalize what had happened. I told myself it was the result of stress, sleep deprivation, and an overactive imagination, but no amount of reasoning could erase the memories of that night. The laughter, the shadows, the suffocating sense of dread. I dropped out of my graduate program, unable to face the prospect of returning to my research. A year has passed since my time in Dudleytown, and I am only now beginning to process the experience. I don't know what I saw or heard in that forest. I don't know if the stories of curses and hauntings are true. What I do know is that the historian and skeptic I once was died in those woods. Something happened to me in Dudleytown. Something I can't explain or understand. And though I've left that place behind, a part of me will always remain there, lost in the shadows.